You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. The salt air burns differently here in the Keys. It carries something else with it, something that makes your skin crawl, even when the sun is blazing overhead and tourists are laughing on the beaches just a few miles away. I learned that the hard way 3 months ago, when I took a job that should have killed me but did something far worse instead. My name is Danny Reeves, and I've been pulling fish from the ocean since I could barely see over a boat's gunnel. 31 years old, with 15 of those years spent working every kind of vessel from Carolina charter boats to Gulf shrimpers, from lobster traps in Maine to tuna boats off the Grand Banks. When my father's 30-year charter business finally went under last spring, crushed by insurance costs and declining tourism, I drifted south like so much driftwood, following the promise of year-round fishing and the kind of pay that could help me start over. Key West felt like salvation when I first saw it. All white sand beaches and crystal clear water stretching to a horizon that promised endless possibilities. The harbour was packed with more fishing boats than I could count, from gleaming sport fishers worth more than most people's houses to working vessels that showed the honest wear of daily use. I figured a man with my experience would have his pick of jobs within a week. I was wrong about a lot of things back then. After 2 weeks of rejections, half-hearted maybes, and promises to call back that never came, I was down to my last $50 and seriously considering a Greyhound ticket back to Carolina. The few jobs I could find were either tourist charters that paid next to nothing, or commercial operations that wanted younger men who'd work for less. At 31, with grey already showing in my beard and old injuries that ached when storms were coming, I was starting to understand that experience wasn't worth as much as I'd thought. I was nursing my third cup of coffee at a waterfront diner, circling want ads that all seemed to require either college degrees or connections I didn't have, when I spotted the index card. It was thumbtacked to the corner of a weather-beaten job board near Mallory Square, so small and unassuming I almost missed it entirely. Experienced deep water fishermen needed, excellent pay, night work, serious inquiries only. Captain Rodriguez, slip 47. No phone number, no detailed requirements. Just an invitation to show up and make a case for myself. The kind of posting that usually meant either desperation or something not quite legitimate. But after 2 weeks of dead ends, I was desperate enough to check it out. Slip 47 housed a boat that had clearly seen better decades. The salty dawn stretched 65 feet of sun-bleached fiberglass and rust stains, her name barely visible on a hull that had weathered countless storms and probably a few hurricanes. Her paint job was more memory than reality, faded to the colour of old bone, with patches of primer showing through like scars. But her lines were good. Her equipment looked maintained, and she had the solid, practical feel of a working vessel that earned her keep, rather than impressing tourists. Captain Rodriguez emerged from the cabin as I approached, wiping his hands on a rag that had seen better days. He was built like an oak stump, all weathered muscle and sun-darkened skin, with eyes the colour of storm clouds, and hands that bore the scars of a lifetime working lines and hooks. Those eyes looked me over like I was a piece of equipment he was considering purchasing, taking in my worn work clothes, my calloused hands, the way I automatically checked the boat's condition, even as we talked.
"You the one asking about work?"
"Yes, sir. Danny Reeves. I've got 15 years experience, worked everything from charter fishing to commercial trawling. References available if you need them." "Florida waters?" "No, sir, but I've worked the Gulf before. Louisiana, Texas. I'm a fast learner and I don't mind hard work." Something flickered across his weathered face, an expression I couldn't quite read. Not quite amusement, not quite pity, but something that made me wonder what I was getting myself into. That's what they all say when they first see this posting. "Come aboard, let me show you around." The deck was spotless despite the boat's weathered appearance. Every line was properly coiled, every piece of equipment secured and maintained with a kind of obsessive care that spoke of a crew that understood their lives depended on their gear. The winches were older but well oiled, the nets showed recent repairs, and the fish hold was clean enough to eat off of. Below deck, the quarters were cramped but functional. 4 narrow bunks built into the hull, a compact galley that smelled of coffee and salt air, and an engine room that hummed with the sound of well-tuned machinery. "We work nights," Rodriguez explained as we toured the vessel, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of command. 3 to 4 days out, depending on conditions and catch. Deep water fishing, 40 to 70 miles out. Places where the big fish run, where most of the other boats don't bother going. "Why nights? Most deep water operations I've worked run dawn to dusk. Because that's when they feed in the deep water, and because day fishermen don't know these waters like they should." He paused, studying my face with those storm cloud eyes. "These aren't normal fishing grounds, son. They require a different kind of understanding." That's when he introduced me to the rest of the crew, and I got my first real hint that this job was going to be unlike anything I'd done before. Tommy Valdez, the first mate, was a thin man in his 40s with prematurely grey hair and the steady hands of someone who'd spent his life working lines and nets. He had the look of someone who'd seen things that didn't sit right with him, but who'd learned to live with them out of necessity. When we were introduced, he nodded politely but didn't smile, and I noticed his eyes constantly flicked to the horizon, even though we were safely tied to the dock. Luis Herrera was the other deckhand, maybe 25 years old, but with the nervous energy of someone who'd aged faster than his years. He kept checking his watch even though it was barely past noon, and when he shook my hand, his palm was slick with sweat despite the cool ocean breeze. There was something haunted about him, like a man who'd seen combat and never quite recovered from it. "Before we discuss terms or schedules," Rodriguez said, producing a metal lockbox from the cabin that looked like it had been around since the boat was new, "you need to understand something important. This operation runs on specific protocols. They're not suggestions, they're not guidelines, and they're sure as hell not up for debate." He handed me a laminated card, the kind you'd find in a hotel room explaining fire evacuation procedures or emergency contacts, but the header read "Vessel Safety Protocol," and what followed made my blood run cold and my mouth go dry. 13 rules, each more bizarre and unsettling than the last. Never fish after 3 a.m. until sunrise. Engines off, all lights except cabin light extinguished. If you hear singing from the water between midnight and 3 a.m, go below deck immediately and cover your ears. Never look directly at the water during a full moon. Wear the provided tinted glasses at all times on deck. I read through all 13, my confusion and unease growing with each line. Rules about throwing back anything that wasn't fish without examination, maintaining specific radio frequencies at all times, never working alone on deck after 10 p.m. There were protocols for when the water turned black, procedures for crew members who began speaking in unknown languages, and strict guidelines about what fish could and couldn't be eaten based on when they were caught. The one that really got to me, that made my hands shake as I held the card, was Rule 8. Any crew member who falls overboard after sunset is not to be rescued. Continue operations. "This is some kind of initiation, right?" I asked, looking up from the card and trying to keep my voice steady. "New guy gets the horror story treatment, see if he scares easy." The silence that followed lasted too long. Tommy and Luis exchanged glances that spoke of shared nightmares and experiences that had bonded them in ways that normal crew relationships couldn't explain. Rodriguez just stared at me with those storm cloud eyes, his expression completely serious. "Luis, show him the photograph." Luis pulled out his wallet with trembling fingers and produced a faded colour photograph, the kind taken with an old Polaroid camera. 5 men stood on the deck of the Salty Dawn, all squinting into bright sunlight, arms draped over each other's shoulders in the easy camaraderie of a successful fishing crew. I recognized Rodriguez, Tommy, and Luis immediately, though they all looked younger and somehow less worn down. The other 2 were strangers, younger men with the confident grins of experienced fishermen, posing with a good catch. 6 months ago, Luis whispered, his voice barely audible over the gentle lapping of waves against the hull. "That's Miller on the left, Jackson on the right. Good fishermen, both of them. Miller had 20 years' experience working the Gulf. Jackson came down from Alaska, used to work the crab boats up there. Where are they now?" "Gone." Tommy's voice carried the weight of witnessed horrors, of things seen that couldn't be unseen. Miller thought Rule 4 was nonsense, decided he wanted to examine something we pulled up in the nets, see what it really was. Jackson figured Rule 1 was just captain being overcautious about engine noise, kept fishing past 3 a.m. on his 3rd night out.
And what happened to them?
Tommy and Luis looked at Rodriguez, who nodded grimly. Miller started screaming around dawn on his 2nd day. Tommy continued, screaming about things crawling under his skin, about voices calling to him from the water. We had to restrain him with rope, but by the time we got back to port, he'd... Tommy shook his head. The things that came out of him weren't human anymore. "Jackson just disappeared," Luis added, his voice cracking. "1 minute he was working the winch, bringing up the biggest catch we'd seen all season. The next minute the boat was empty except for us 3. We found his safety harness cut clean through, like something with razors had sliced it, but there was no blood, no sign of struggle, just gone." I stared at the photograph, then back at the rules, my mind racing. Every rational part of my consciousness screamed to walk away, to find normal work on a normal boat with normal safety procedures, and crews that didn't carry photographs of missing men. But I'd been out of work for 2 months, my savings were completely gone, and Rodriguez was offering 3 times what most commercial boats paid, plus bonuses based on catch size. "If I follow these rules exactly as written," I said carefully, trying to keep the desperation out of my voice, "what guarantee do I have that I'll make it back to port alive?" "No guarantees in this business," Rodriguez replied, his voice matter of fact. "Ocean doesn't care about your plans or your future, but follow the rules, respect the water and what lives in it, and you'll have the same chance we do." "And what chance is that?" "Better than you might think, worse than you'd hope." That night, I sat in my cheap motel room with its stained carpet and air conditioner that sounded like a dying animal, memorizing the 13 rules and trying to make sense of what I'd gotten myself into. I read each one dozens of times, looking for hidden meanings or practical explanations that might make them seem less insane. I tried to find logical reasons why a fishing crew would need such bizarre protocols, why experienced fishermen would take such strange precautions seriously. Nothing made sense. The rules seemed designed to avoid something, but what that something might be was completely beyond my understanding. They read like the kind of superstitious nonsense that landlubbers thought fishermen believed, except these men clearly took them as seriously as life and death survival procedures. I spent hours on my laptop, searching for information about unusual fishing practices in the Gulf, about boats that worked unusual schedules or followed strange protocols. I found plenty of stories about superstitious fishermen, about crews that wouldn't sail on certain days or boats that carried lucky charms, but nothing that resembled the specific, detailed rules Rodriguez had given me. Around 3 a.m, I finally gave up my research and tried to get some sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw that photograph of the 5 fishermen. I saw the empty spaces where Miller and Jackson should have been standing. I thought about their families, about people who were probably still wondering what had happened to experienced fishermen who'd simply vanished from a fishing boat in calm seas. The next evening, as the sun was setting over Key West, I met the crew at the marina. We spent an hour loading supplies and equipment, checking engines and navigation systems, preparing for what Rodriguez described as a standard 3-day run to the deep waters. Everything looked normal, professional, exactly like dozens of fishing trips I'd taken before. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that everyone was preparing for something more dangerous than hauling nets full of fish. As we pulled away from the dock, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. Other fishermen at the marina were watching us leave, but none of them waved or called out the usual good luck wishes that fishing crews exchanged. They just watched with faces that carried too much knowledge, expressions that suggested they knew exactly where we were going and what kinds of risks we'd be facing. "Why do they look at us like that?" I asked Tommy as Key West's lights began to fade behind us. "Because they know where we're going," he replied, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "And they know the price you sometimes have to pay for fishing those waters." "What kind of price?" "The kind you don't understand until you have to pay it." The run to our fishing grounds took 5 hours, following a course that seemed to avoid all the standard shipping lanes and fishing areas marked on the nautical charts. As we travelled further from shore, the water changed from the clear blue-green of shallow seas to the deep indigo of truly profound depths. I'd fished deep water before, worked boats that went 60 and 70 miles offshore, but something about these particular waters felt fundamentally different from anything I'd experienced. The air grew stiller as we travelled until the usual ocean breeze died to nothing, and the surface of the water became as smooth as black glass. The horizon seemed to curve wrong somehow, as if we were travelling over a sphere slightly smaller than Earth. Most unsettling of all, the usual sounds of ocean life: seabirds, dolphins, the distant engines of other boats, faded to an oppressive silence that made our own engine noise seem unnaturally loud. Rodriguez navigated using coordinates from a handwritten logbook that looked like it had been passed down through generations. The pages were yellow, with age and salt spray filled with notations in different handwritings that spanned decades. Some entries were in Spanish, others in English, and a few in what looked like Portuguese or maybe Italian. All of them seemed to reference the same general area, the same coordinates that we were approaching. "My grandfather started fishing these waters in 1953, Rodriguez explained when I asked about the unusual course and the ancient logbook. "Learned the rules from fishermen who'd been working here since before the Second World War. The coordinates, the protocols, the prices you pay for the catches you take. It's all been passed down from father to son, captain to crew, for longer than anyone remembers." "What kind of prices?" "The kind you don't want to think about until you absolutely have to pay them." We reached our destination just as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reflected off the water like spilled blood. The water here was so deep, it appeared almost black even in the fading sunlight, stretching away in all directions without any sign of land or other vessels. It felt like we'd sailed off the edge of the world into some forgotten corner of the ocean that didn't appear on any official charts. The depth finder showed bottom at 847 feet, but something about the readings seemed wrong. The numbers flickered and jumped as if the equipment couldn't get a solid fix, and occasionally the screen would show impossible readings, depths that would put us over underwater mountain ranges or abyssal plains that shouldn't exist in this part of the Gulf. "Equipment's always a little screwy out here," Tommy explained when I mentioned the strange readings. Magnetic anomalies, thermal layers, who knows what else. The fish don't seem to mind, and that's what matters. First night's always the hardest, Luis added as we prepared the nets and equipment. You'll see things, hear things that don't make sense, according to everything you know about the ocean. Don't try to rationalize them or explain them away. Just follow the rules and keep your head down until you understand what we're dealing with. At 8:30 p.m, with the last light fading from the sky, we deployed our first nets. The sonar showed massive schools of fish at various depths, exactly the kind of deep water species that brought premium prices at market. Red snapper, grouper, amberjack, and others I didn't immediately recognize. For the first hour, everything felt completely normal. We worked with the efficient rhythm of an experienced crew, hauling in net after net of beautiful fish that would pay for fuel, supplies, and crew shares with plenty left over for profit. Then, at 9:15 p.m, everything changed. The first net came up heavier than expected, the winch straining against the weight that didn't match what the sonar had shown. Along with the usual catch of legitimate fish, tangled in the mesh like some kind of massive parasitic growth, was something that defied easy description or rational explanation. At first glance, it looked like an enormous jellyfish, translucent and gelatinous, maybe 4 feet across and pulsing with its own internal rhythms. But as we hauled it closer to the surface, I could see it was something far stranger. It pulsed with its own internal light that shifted through colours I'd never seen before. Not just blue and green, but shades that seemed to exist between the normal spectrum. Colours that made my eyes water and my head ache just to look at them. Worse, much worse, it seemed to be watching us. What I'd initially taken for random patterns in its translucent flesh resolved into something that might have been eyes. Dozens of them, all different sizes, all tracking our movements with unmistakable intelligence. When it pulsed, the lights inside it formed patterns that looked almost like writing, like some kind of bioluminescent language that conveyed meanings I couldn't even begin to guess at. "Rule 4, Tommy called out sharply, his voice cutting through my fascination with the impossible thing in our net. Without hesitation, Rodriguez grabbed a gaff hook and speared the creature, lifting it carefully over the side of the boat. As soon as the hook touched it, the thing flashed once with brilliant light that left spots dancing in my vision, then began to sing. Not with sound, but with vibrations that I felt in my bones, my teeth, the metal of the boat itself. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. A song that spoke of depths and pressures and spaces between spaces where things that shouldn't exist made their homes. As it hit the water, the creature flashed again and disappeared into the depths, trailing luminous tentacles that looked like falling stars, sinking into a black ocean. "What the hell was that?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my efforts to sound calm and professional. "Doesn't matter," Rodriguez replied, already turning back to the nets, as if hauling up impossible sea creatures was just part of the normal routine. Rule 4 says anything that isn't fish goes back immediately. No examination, no questions, no exceptions. But that thing was obviously intelligent. It was trying to communicate. "Rule 4, Tommy interrupted firmly. "That's all you need to know." At 9:45 p.m, we brought up another net, this one containing something even more disturbing. Mixed in with a beautiful catch of red snapper was what looked, at first glance, like a human body. But as we pulled it closer, I could see it wasn't human at all, despite the general shape. It had too many joints in its arms and legs, fingers that were too long and ended in what looked like gills instead of fingernails, and skin that shifted colour like a cuttlefish trying to blend with its surroundings. Its eyes were open and aware, tracking our movements with an intelligence that was definitely not human, but was undeniably real. When it saw us looking at it, it opened its mouth and made a sound like whale song mixed with static from a broken radio. Beautiful and haunting and absolutely terrifying. "Rule 4, Luis called out, but his voice was shaking. Rodriguez used the gaff hook again, but this time the creature grabbed the metal with those impossible hands and tried to pull itself toward the boat. For a moment, it hung there in our lights, staring at us with eyes that held far too much understanding, making sounds that were almost like words in a language that predated human speech. Then, Rodriguez twisted the hook and sent it back into the dark water, where it disappeared with what sounded disturbingly like relieved laughter. "How many of these things are down there?" I asked, trying to keep the terror out of my voice. "More than you want to know about," Rodriguez replied, "and they're all curious about us, all interested in what we're doing up here in the shallow water. The rules keep us safe from their curiosity." At 10 p.m, I was sorting through our legitimate catch when I realized I was alone on deck. Tommy and Luis had gone below to check equipment and update the logbook, and Rodriguez was in the cabin monitoring radio traffic and weather reports. I'd been by myself for maybe 3 minutes, just long enough to start feeling comfortable with the rhythm of the work, when Luis's head popped up from the cabin hatch. "Rule 6, he called urgently, his face pale with genuine fear. "Never alone after 10 p.m. I looked around, realizing my mistake. The deck felt different when you were alone on it. More exposed, more vulnerable to whatever might be watching from the dark water around us. Luis scrambled up on deck, constantly scanning the horizon, as if he expected something to come out of the darkness at any moment. "Even 3 minutes can be too long," he explained, his voice tight with anxiety. "Especially out here, especially when they know we're around." "Too long for what?" "For things to notice you're vulnerable, to realize you're separated from the group. They're smart, Danny. Smarter than we are in some ways. And they're always watching, always waiting for someone to make a mistake." The night progressed with a rhythm unlike anything I'd ever experienced on a fishing boat. Every crew member constantly monitored the time, checked the radio, and watched the water with an intensity that went far beyond normal caution. There was a choreographed quality to their movements, as if they'd rehearsed specific responses to specific situations dozens of times. At 11:30 p.m, our radio began crackling with static, the clear jazz music we'd been listening to, dissolving into harsh white noise that hurt to listen to. Tommy immediately rushed to adjust the frequency, spinning the dial frantically until the static cleared and the music returned. But now it was different music, older with a scratchy quality that suggested it was coming from very far away. "Rule 5, he explained, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. "Radio stays tuned to 101.7 FM at all times. If we lose the signal, if static takes over, we have maybe minutes before they realize we can't hear the warnings anymore." "What warnings?" "The broadcasts that tell us when to move, when to stop fishing, when to run. There are people on shore who monitor these waters, who've been watching them for longer than any of us have been alive. When they tell us to do something, we do it without question." But it was what happened at 12:47 a.m. that truly shattered my understanding of the world and everything I thought I knew about what lived in the ocean. We were hauling in our largest catch of the night, nets full of premium fish that would bring top dollar at market, when the singing started. It began as a single voice drifting across the water from somewhere out in the darkness, beautiful and haunting in a way that made my chest ache with longing I couldn't explain. The melody was unlike anything I'd ever heard, rising and falling with mathematical precision that somehow conveyed emotions I didn't have names for. The voice was definitely female, or at least something approximating femininity, with a clarity and range that no human throat could produce. It sang in a language that wasn't quite language, more like pure emotion given sound, and it spoke of loneliness and longing and depths that no sunlight had ever touched. "Below deck now," Rodriguez shouted, but his crew was already moving. With practiced urgency, Tommy and Luis scrambled for the cabin hatch, hands pressed over their ears, faces twisted with what looked like physical pain. I hesitated for just a moment, transfixed by the incredible beauty of that voice. In that moment of hesitation, more voices joined the first. Harmonies layered upon harmonies, creating music that seemed to resonate in my bones, in my blood, in parts of my brain that I'd never known existed. The sound was so beautiful it hurt, so perfect it felt like it might kill me just by existing. Rodriguez grabbed my arm and yanked me towards the hatch with strength that belied his age. "Don't listen," he screamed over the swelling chorus. "For the love of God, don't listen to what they're saying." We huddled in the cramped cabin, hands clamped over our ears, but the music seemed to penetrate everything. It vibrated through the hull of the boat, through our bones, through our very souls. I could feel it trying to get inside my head, promising things that I wanted desperately but couldn't quite understand. Luis was rocking back and forth in his bunk, tears streaming down his face, muttering prayers in rapid-fire Spanish. Tommy gripped his silver crucifix so tightly his knuckles had gone white, his lips moving in what looked like a desperate mantra. Rodriguez sat perfectly still, eyes squeezed shut, but I could see the strain on his face, the tremendous effort it was taking him to resist whatever the voices were offering. The singing continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Layer upon layer of impossible harmonies that spoke of things beyond human experience, of beauty and terror intertwined so completely that I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. The voices promised knowledge, promised power, promised answers to questions I'd never known I wanted to ask. All I had to do was come to them, just step outside and let them show me the wonders that waited in the deep places of the world. At 1:23 a.m. the music stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete it felt like the world had died. We waited, hardly daring to breathe, until Rodriguez finally nodded and we climbed back on deck with shaking legs and hammering hearts. The night air felt different now, charged with potential energy, like the moments before a lightning strike. The water around the boat was perfectly still, reflecting the stars like black glass, but I had the unsettling feeling that things were moving just beneath the surface, vast shapes gliding through the depths with purposes I couldn't begin to fathom. "What was that?" I whispered, my voice hoarse as if I'd been screaming. "Something that lives in the deep places," Rodriguez replied, his own voice shaky with residual fear. "Something that's been here since before humans learned to make fire, since before we crawled out of the oceans ourselves. The singing is how they communicate, how they hunt, how they try to lure people down to join them." "What happens if you listen too long?" "You start to understand what they're saying. And once you understand, once you really hear what they're offering, you can't resist going to them. They promise everything you've ever wanted, everything you've ever dreamed of, and they deliver on those promises. But the price they ask in return." "What price?" "Everything you are, everything you were, everything you ever could be." The rest of the night passed in tense, nervous quiet. We continued fishing, bringing up catch after catch of premium, deep water species, but everyone jumped at every sound, every splash, every creak of the boat's rigging. At 2:30 a.m. we hauled in an enormous school of red snapper, easily the most valuable catch of the night and probably worth several $1,000s at market prices. But when Rodriguez checked his watch and then checked the logbook to see when we'd deployed the net, his face went pale as old bone. "What time did we put this net in the water?" he asked Tommy. Tommy checked the log, running his finger down the entries we'd made throughout the night. 2:05 a.m, Captain." Without another word, without any discussion or debate, Rodriguez ordered the entire catch thrown overboard. Hundreds of pounds of perfect fish, worth thousands of dollars, disappeared back into the dark water like an offering to whatever lived in the depths below us. "Rule 10, he explained grimly when he saw my expression. "Never eat fish caught during the 2 o'clock to 3 a.m. hour. Throw entire catch overboard if necessary." Risk of what? They looked like perfectly normal fish. Did they? Look again? I looked at the few fish that remained in the bottom of the net, the stragglers that hadn't gone overboard, with the main catch. At first glance, they did look like normal red snapper, but as I studied them more closely, I began to notice details that made my skin crawl. Their scales had a strange iridescent quality that shifted colour in the light. Their eyes were too large, too aware, and seemed to track movement even though the fish were clearly dead. Most disturbing of all, when I looked closely at their gills, I could swear I saw tiny formations that looked almost like teeth. "Jesus Christ," I breathed. "They take the shape of normal fish during that hour," Rodriguez explained. "Perfect mimics, perfect camouflage. But if you eat them, if you take them into your body, they change back to their original form, and then you become part of them, part of whatever lives down there in the deep places." At 2:55 a.m., as we prepared to shut down operations for the night according to rule number 1, the water around our boat began to change. What had been deep blue-black was turning to absolute darkness, spreading outward from our hull like spilled ink. But this wasn't just an absence of colour, it was an absence of everything, a darkness so complete it seemed to devour light itself. "Rule 7, Luis called out, his voice tight with terror. "Black water protocol." Rodriguez immediately shut down the engines and dropped anchor. "Nobody moves until it passes," he ordered. "No lights, no sound, no sudden movements. And whatever you do, don't look directly into the water." For 37 minutes we sat motionless as the darkness spread around us like a living thing. I tried to follow Rodriguez's advice about not looking into the water, but it was impossible to resist completely. In brief glances, I caught sight of shapes moving in that absolute blackness. Massive forms that defied the laws of physics and biology. Things that were too large, too wrong, too impossible to exist in any sane universe. Something brushed against our hull with a sound like fingernails on a chalkboard. A scraping that seemed to go on forever. The boat shuddered and creaked, but held steady. In the distance, I could hear splashing and what sounded like breathing. Huge, slow inhalations and exhalations that suggested lungs the size of buildings. At one point, something surfaced near the boat. I couldn't see it clearly in the absolute darkness, but I could hear it breathing, could feel the displacement of water as something enormous moved just below the surface. It stayed there for several minutes, as if studying us, before disappearing back into the depths with a sound like distant thunder. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the darkness began to recede. Normal watercolor returned gradually, like dawn breaking over a black landscape, and we were alone again on the starlit sea. "What the hell lives down there?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "Things that were here before the continents formed," Rodriguez replied, his hands shaking as he restarted the engines. "Things that will be here long after humanity is forgotten. The rules keep us safe from them, but only if we follow them exactly, only if we show them the respect they demand." "How do you know all this? How did anyone learn these rules in the first place?" "Trial and error," Tommy said grimly. "Lots of dead fishermen, lots of boats that never came back. My grandfather told me stories about the early days, when people first started fishing these waters seriously. They lost a lot of boats, a lot of men, before they figured out the patterns." "What patterns?" "When it's safe to fish, when it's not. What to avoid, what to throw back. What times of day and night bring out things that shouldn't be disturbed. The rules aren't arbitrary, Danny. They're a survival guide for waters that operate by laws older than human civilization." As dawn approached, we secured our gear and prepared for the run back to port. Despite the supernatural encounters and the nerve-shredding terror of the night, we'd had an incredibly successful fishing trip. Our hold was packed with high-quality, deep-water species that would bring premium prices at market, enough to cover fuel and supplies with a generous profit for everyone involved. "You did good, Danny," Tommy said as Key West's lights appeared on the horizon like a promise of safety and sanity. "Followed the rules, kept your head when things got strange. Maybe you'll make it after all." "How long before it stops feeling completely insane?" "Never," Luis replied with a bitter laugh. "You just get better at functioning while insane." The second night followed a similar pattern, but I was better prepared for the strangeness. We encountered the black water twice, heard the singing for nearly an hour, and threw back several catches that contained things that definitely weren't fish, and definitely weren't from any ocean that appeared on nautical charts. One of them looked almost human, but with skin that shifted between scales and flesh, depending on the angle of the light. Another appeared to be made of living crystal that hummed with its own internal music, creating harmonies that made my teeth ache. A third was something that hurt to look at directly, a form that seemed to exist in more dimensions than my brain could process. Each encounter reinforced my understanding that these waters operated by rules that had nothing to do with normal marine biology or oceanography. The protocols weren't arbitrary maritime superstitions. They were a carefully developed survival guide for a place where ancient things still held power, where the normal laws of nature were more like gentle suggestions. On our second night, we also encountered Rule 11 for the first time. Luis was working the nets around 1:30 a.m. when he suddenly stopped what he was doing and began speaking in what sounded like Latin, but wasn't quite Latin. The words flowed from his mouth in a steady stream, beautiful and rhythmic and completely incomprehensible. Tommy and I immediately moved to restrain him, following the protocol exactly as Rodriguez had drilled us. Luis didn't resist, didn't even seem aware that we were touching him. His eyes had gone completely black, not just the pupils but the entire visible surface, and the words kept flowing from his mouth in that beautiful, terrifying language that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to some primitive part of my brain. We carried him below deck and secured him to his bunk, with rope, just as the rules specified. He continued speaking for another 20 minutes, the words growing more urgent, more passionate, as if he was trying to convince someone of something desperately important. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the flow of words stopped and his eyes returned to normal. "What happened?" he asked, looking around in confusion. "Why am I tied up?" "Rule 11, Rodriguez explained. "You were speaking in the old language. Do you remember what you were saying?" Luis shook his head, but I could see fear creeping into his eyes. "I remember voices, beautiful voices calling to me from the water. They wanted to tell me something important, something that would change everything." "That's how it starts," Tommy said grimly. "First they make you speak their language. Then they start speaking through you. If we hadn't caught it in time, what would have happened?" "You would have walked into the water," Rodriguez replied, "and you would have kept walking until you reached them, no matter how deep you had to go." On the third night, I felt almost confident. I understood the rhythm of the work now, the careful balance between productive fishing and avoiding the attention of things that were better left undisturbed. The rules made sense within the context of these impossible waters, each protocol designed to avoid a specific type of encounter with entities that existed outside normal reality. That confidence became my downfall. It was 2:47 a.m. when we encountered the largest school of fish I'd ever seen. The sonar screen lit up like a constellation, showing what had to be thousands of pounds of prime, deep-water species moving in perfect formation below us. Red snapper, grouper, amberjack, and other species I couldn't immediately identify, all swimming together in numbers that defied belief. This was the kind of catch that fishing crews dreamed about, the kind that could set a man up for years if handled properly. The school was so massive that our nets could barely contain a fraction of it, and every haul brought up fish so perfect they looked like they'd been designed by someone who understood exactly what restaurant buyers were looking for. I was operating the main winch, bringing up net after net of beautiful fish while Tommy and Luis worked to sort and store the catch. Red snapper the size of dinner plates, their scales gleaming like polished copper in our work lights. Grouper that weighed 30 pounds each, with flesh so white and perfect it looked like marble. Amberjack with streamlined bodies that spoke of speed and power, their silver sides reflecting our lights like mirrors. The work was hypnotic in its rhythm. The steady thrum of the winch motor, the splash of nets hitting water, the silver flash of perfect fish in our lights, the satisfying weight of each haul as it came aboard. I fell into a trance-like state, focused entirely on the enormous school of fish below us and the mechanical process of bringing them to the surface. The catches were so good, so consistent, that I lost track of everything else. The careful time-fine monitoring that had become second nature over the past 2 nights. The constant awareness of our position relative to the rules, the hypervigilant, watching for signs that we were attracting unwanted attention. All of it faded into background noise as I concentrated on hauling up the catch of a lifetime, which is why I didn't notice when my watch hit 3 a.m. Rule number 1 was absolute, the foundation that all the other protocols were built on. Never fish after 3 a.m. until sunrise. Engines off, all lights except cabin light extinguished. All fishing operations ceased immediately. But I was in the middle of bringing up the biggest haul of our entire trip, a net so full of premium fish that the winch was straining against the weight and I couldn't stop the operation without losing everything. "Danny!" Rodriguez's voice cut through the night like a knife, sharp with panic and desperation. "Danny, check your watch." I looked down at my wrist and felt my blood turn to ice water. 3:02 a.m. I'd been fishing for 2 minutes past the deadline, 2 minutes into the forbidden time when whatever lived in these waters became actively hostile to human presence. "Shut it down," Rodriguez screamed from the cabin. "Shut everything down now." But it was too late. The nets were already coming up. The engines were running at full power to handle the massive catch, and every light on the boat blazed like a beacon in the darkness. I tried to stop the winch, but the controls weren't responding properly. The system seemed to have taken on a life of its own, determined to complete the operation regardless of the rules we'd violated. That's when the water exploded. It started as movement far below us, visible on the sonar as something massive rising from depths that shouldn't have supported life. The screen flickered and went dead as whatever was coming up passed beyond the range of our equipment, beyond the range of anything designed to measure normal ocean depths. The boat's lights began to strobe and flicker in patterns that hurt to look at. Our radio erupted in static so loud and harsh it sounded like the screaming of tortured metal, mixed with voices speaking in languages that predated human speech. The water around us didn't just turn black. It turned into something that hurt to perceive. A darkness so complete it seemed to reach up from the depths with fingers of liquid shadow that grasped at our lights and tried to pull them down into the abyss. I could feel the boat pitching and rolling as something vast moved beneath us, something so large that its passage through the water created currents and eddies that threatened to capsize us. The deck vibrated under my feet with a rhythm that felt organic, like a heartbeat or breathing, but scaled up to proportions that defied comprehension. That's when I felt it wrap around my ankle. It was cold beyond description, whatever grabbed me. Not just the cold of deep water, but the cold of absolute zero, of entropy itself, of spaces between stars where heat and light had never existed. It felt alive, but not in any way I could understand, not following any biological pattern that made sense. It was liquid, but with purpose, flowing, but with terrible, irresistible strength. I looked down and saw something that shattered my sanity like glass hitting concrete. It wasn't water that held me, not entirely. It was part of something much larger, something that existed in the spaces between reality and nightmare. It moved like liquid mercury but gripped like living muscle, and it was pulling me towards the rail with the inexorable force of gravity itself. The thing that had me wasn't malicious exactly. It was more like a natural force, like being caught in a riptide or a hurricane. It simply was, and I was in its way. And it was going to take me with it back to whatever realm it had emerged from. I screamed once, a sound of pure terror that I'd never heard myself make before. A noise that seemed to come from some primitive part of my brain that understood exactly how much danger I was in. Rodriguez, Tommy, and Luis appeared at the rail, their faces pale with horror and resignation. But they weren't trying to rescue me. They couldn't. Rule number 8 was absolute. Any crew member who falls overboard after sunset is not to be rescued. I saw Rodriguez cross himself and whisper what sounded like a prayer as I went over the side. Tommy was saying something, but his words were lost in the chaos of failing equipment and rising water. Luis just stared, his face blank with shock and terror. The water was warm when I hit it, which surprised me more than anything else. I'd expected the crushing cold of deep ocean, but it felt like a heated swimming pool, almost welcoming in its embrace. That's when I realized that I wasn't drowning. Whatever had pulled me overboard was keeping me alive, sustaining me for reasons I didn't want to contemplate but could probably guess. I was pulled down through layers of impossible darkness, past depths where the pressure should have crushed me instantly, to places that existed outside the normal laws of physics and biology. The water around me was full of lights, not the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures, but something far stranger and more purposeful. Lights that moved with intelligence, that seemed to watch me with curiosity that felt older than human civilization. As I descended, I began to see them clearly. The things that lived in these deep places, the entities that the rules were designed to avoid and appease. They were beautiful and terrible in equal measure, beings of living water and crystallized starlight that had been swimming in Earth's oceans since before the continents formed into their current shapes. They surrounded me as I sank, communicating in harmonics that I felt rather than heard, frequencies that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to my nervous system. I understood, without knowing how, that I had become something precious to them, a violation of the ancient compact, a breach of the rules that had kept the surface world safe for generations. They showed me things as I descended, visions of the ocean as it really was, not the empty wilderness that humans imagined, but a vast civilization that existed in dimensions we couldn't perceive. Cities of coral and living light that stretched across the ocean floor, populated by beings whose thought processes were so alien that human minds couldn't grasp even the basics of their existence. I saw the history of the rules, the slow process by which human fishermen had learned to coexist with entities that could have wiped out our species without effort. The careful negotiations, the prices paid in blood and sanity, the delicate balance that allowed both species to share the same waters without destroying each other. And I saw what happened to those who broke the rules. Miller was there, or what Miller had become. His human form was gone, replaced by something that was partly flesh and partly living water, swimming through the depths with movements that suggested he was perfectly adapted to his new environment. He looked at me with eyes that still held traces of human recognition, but also with something else, a contentment, a sense of belonging that suggested his transformation had been less punishment than evolution. Jackson was there too, but changed in a different way. He'd become something that existed partially in normal space and partially in dimensions that my brain couldn't process, flickering in and out of visibility as he moved. When he tried to communicate, His words came out as music, as harmonies that conveyed meaning more directly than language ever could. They weren't suffering. That was the most disturbing thing of all. They'd been transformed into something that no longer fit any human definition of life, but they seemed genuinely happy with their new existence. They tried to show me what they'd gained, the knowledge and experiences that came with joining the deep civilization, but my human mind couldn't grasp more than fragments of what they were trying to communicate. And then, in the deepest part of my descent, I met the thing that spoke for all the others. I still don't have words for what it was. It existed in more dimensions than humans can perceive, a being of such complexity and ancient wisdom that trying to understand it was like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. When it communicated, it didn't use language or even the harmonic frequencies that the others favored. It spoke directly to my consciousness, downloading concepts and information that my brain wasn't designed to handle. It offered me a choice, and in that moment, I understood that this had always been the plan. The rules weren't just about avoiding the deep entities. They were about maintaining a selection process, a way for the ocean civilization to identify humans who might be capable of bridging the gap between our species. I could join them, become part of their eternal dance in the deep places, give up my humanity in exchange for existence beyond death and knowledge beyond imagination. The transformation would be complete and irreversible, but it would also be a kind of transcendence that most humans could never even dream of achieving. Or I could return to the surface world as their messenger, their warning to others who might think the rules were negotiable. I would carry part of them with me always, a fragment of their consciousness that would allow me to serve as a conduit between the two worlds. The choice was no choice at all, really. I wasn't ready to give up my humanity, wasn't prepared for the kind of transformation that would leave me unrecognizable to everyone I'd ever known. But I also understood that I couldn't return to my old life unchanged. I'd seen too much, learned too much, to ever be the same person who'd answered that job posting in Key West. I chose to return, and the ancient thing that spoke for the deep civilization accepted my decision with what might have been approval, but before releasing me, it made sure I understood the price of my choice. I would carry their message in my blood and bones, in dreams and waking visions that would never completely leave me alone. I would serve as their warning to the surface world, their reminder that the rules existed for reasons that went far beyond human understanding. The ascent was faster than the descent, a rush through layers of pressure and darkness that should have killed me, but somehow left me unharmed. I surfaced in daylight, gasping and choking on normal air that tasted strange after breathing the impossible atmosphere of the deep places. I was floating in calm seas about 3 miles off Marathon, with no memory of how I'd gotten there, or how much time had passed since I'd gone overboard. A Coast Guard patrol boat found me within an hour, hypothermic and babbling about things that made no sense to the crew members who pulled me aboard. They took me to a hospital in Key West, where doctors couldn't explain how I'd survived in the water for what must have been days without drowning or dying of exposure. My blood work showed impossible results, trace elements that didn't exist in normal seawater, cellular changes that suggested exposure to pressures that should have liquefied my bones. The Coast Guard investigation found the Salty Dawn anchored safely at her home slip, her crew of 3 reporting a successful fishing run with no incidents or accidents. When investigators asked about the 4th crew member listed on their manifest, Rodriguez simply stated that Danny Reeves had left the vessel voluntarily at sea, which was technically true in ways that no official report could ever capture. I never went back to Key West. The very thought of being near those waters again filled me with a mixture of longing and terror that I couldn't handle. I moved as far inland as I could get, found work in Kansas grain elevators and Nebraska cattle ranches, anything that kept me away from large bodies of water, but I carry their message with me always, the warning that burns in my blood like poisoned fire. In my dreams, I still hear the singing from the deep places, still see the lights moving through impossible depths. Sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, I can feel them calling to me, reminding me that their offer still stands, that the transformation they promised is always available if I change my mind. The ocean is not empty, the deep places are not dead, and there are things swimming in the darkness that have been waiting patiently for humanity to forget the old agreements, the careful treaties that keep both species safe from each other. Somewhere off the coast of Florida, the salty dawn is still fishing those impossible waters, still following the 13 rules that keep her crew alive, still bringing back catches that no other boat can match, and eventually, inevitably, they'll need to replace another crew member. The job posting is still there, I'm sure, thumbtacked to that weather-beaten board at Mallory Square, waiting for the next desperate fisherman who thinks he can outsmart rules written in blood and starlight. A simple white index card that promises good money and steady work to anyone experienced enough, desperate enough, or foolish enough to think they understand what they're getting into. If you see it, if you're tempted by the promise of easy money and premium catches, remember what I've told you. Remember that some waters exact prices that go beyond money, beyond life, beyond everything you think you understand about the world and your place in it. The sea keeps its bargains, and the old things that swim in its deepest places are very, very patient. They've been waiting since before humans learned to make fire, and they'll wait until long after our species has forgotten how to dream. But they're also very, very hungry for new members to join their ancient civilization, and they're always watching for someone arrogant enough to think the rules don't apply to them, someone confident enough to believe that 15 years of fishing experience makes them immune to forces that predate human evolution. Someone exactly like I used to be, before I learned that the ocean has been keeping secrets far longer than humans have been trying to uncover them. The water remembers everything and forgives nothing, and sometimes late at night when the wind is still and the world feels like it's holding its breath, I can still hear them singing in the darkness, calling me home to depths where the rules are different and the price of knowledge is everything you used to be.